stop right there. I know what you're thinking. Turrets, romantic moonlight, and knights who smell faintly of musk and virtue. You think castles are cozy fairy tale homes, but actually most of them are damp, infested, and built like medieval panic rooms for people who expect to be stabbed. Over the next 18 minutes, we're peeling back the velvet curtain to reveal the blood, blight, and bureaucracy that made these stone stage sets nightmares in real life. You think Bran Castle is Dracula's lair because Hollywood said so, but actually Vlad the Impaler barely lived here, and the castle's Dracula brand is a 20th century marketing miracle. The walls smell of old wood, boiled cabbage from the kitchens, and the ghost of opportunism. Local guides sell you myths with a smile and a garlic necklace. Behind the tourist trinkets are cramped rooms, crooked staircases, and a past of occupation and power games. Less fangs, more tax collectors. You think the spooky rooms are for atmosphere, but actually Bran houses real whispers of imprisonment and inconvenient royal deaths. Families who own the castle left belongings with no explanation, and there are hidden cellars where prisoners once suffocated under overcrowded filth. Smell the damp stone and oil. This isn't a movie set. It's where the aristocracy disposed of problems quietly, and the local legends grew around silence and missing people. You think it's just a creepy castle with a poor location, but actually Houska was built over what locals called a void, a pit of unnatural darkness that supposedly vomited demons. Nobility built the castle not to defend territory, but to keep something locked away and inconveniently quiet. People reported animal mutilations, voices, and worse. The architecture screams containment rather than fortress, with no strategic view and an obsessive focus on that hole in the ground. You think the stories were pure superstition, but actually accounts from the 19th and 20th centuries describe animals mutilated and impossible sounds escaping that pit. The castle's layout suggests people once monitored or experimented on that void. Think of it as proto-obsessive containment research mixed with medieval theology. Visitors left talismans and prayers. Locals avoided the place at night. If dungeon had a sister word, Houska would be it. Containment, caution, and a chronic smell of burnt hair. You think Predjama is just a clever architectural stunt, but actually it was a defensible fortress spying on the mountain itself, with secret passages that let inhabitants vanish into the cliff like bad magicians. Imagine living above a yawning cave, rats, dripping water, and the constant echo of your own paranoia. The famous legend of Erasum the outlaw, who survived sieges by sneaking out through the cave, turns heroism into a sanitation nightmare. Limited waste control, stale air, and the smell of desperation turning to myth. You think siege stories are about heroics, but Predjama's legend is a lesson in logistics. Sieges mean human waste, disease, and boredom, not cinematic sword fights. The outlaw survived by clandestine supply lines through the cave, but the castle eventually fell because no one invents a medieval plumbing system to satisfy long-term survival. Betrayal came from something far less romantic than a jealous suitor. An arrow dispatched through a latrine window, ending a career and proving medieval sanitation was a political tool. You think Welsh castles are quaint tourist postcards, but Conwy was less charming and more a concrete megaphone for royal intimidation. Picture sentries with mud-slick boots, cooks yelling over smoky fires, and nobles using the castle to lord over a town where taxes arrived like thunderstorms. The walls hold stories of brutal reprisals, captured leaders, and a bureaucratic cruelty that made life for commoners a slow squeeze toward starvation, instead of a dramatic execution scene. You think castles were clean command centers, but Conwy's stables and cellars tell a different story. Animals kept in ankles-deep filth, horses fed the best while peasants were starving. During sieges the food went to the garrison and the town was left to rot, a cruel logistical funnel. People whisper about heroic last stands, but real suffering happened quietly. Disease spreading through thick air, children weakened by hunger, and the castle's shadow becoming the town's slow suffocation. You think Edinburgh Castle is all crown jewels and bagpipes, but actually it's a layered mausoleum of violence, prisons, and public executions. The rock itself was a dumping ground for bodies after battles, and the dungeons beneath smell of iron, urine, and the despair that clung to political prisoners. The crown's sparkle dresses a history of torture, and if you listen closely in the barracks, you'll hear the creak of bureaucracy squeezing dissent into silence. You think the executions were rare pageants, but Edinburgh's dungeons were routine factories of human misery. Cramped cells, rats, and executions used as public policy. Diseases like scurvy and dysentery ran rampant in captivity, turning prisoners into walking corpses faster than any sword. The Crown used the threat of public hanging as a budget line item. Keep control cheap, visible and terrifying, so tax compliance looks like a good life choice. You think Neuschwanstein is the perfect Disney inspiration, but actually, Ludwig II's fantasy was a debt-fueled mental hotel with servants on the edge of breakdown. The castle was a gilded prison of taste where every room was curated to an obsession, and reality, plumbing, heating, and budgets were politely ignored. Ludwig's flamboyant escapism ended with forced deposition and a mysterious death in a lake. The fairy tale facade hides a human wreckage of isolation and bankruptcy. You think the rooms are living monuments, but inside Neuschwanstein you'll find luxury that smells faintly of stale perfume and abandonment. Servants had to maintain opulence that Ludwig never used properly. The heating was insufficient, and corridors were lonely echo chambers. The king's taste became a prison for caretakers preserving illusions, making the castle less a home and more a mausoleum to a failed fantasy project. You think Corvin Castle is a romantic Gothic postcard, but actually it boasts some of the most notorious torture chambers recorded in Eastern Europe. The castle was designed for display and intimidation. Spikes, pits, and ornate devices meant to terrify as much as to punish. The narratives grew into myth, Vlad connections, and ghost stories. But beneath the legend are lists of victims who were broken quietly and methodically inside its damp walls. You think the devices were theatrical, but Corvin's tools were brutal and practical. Thumbscrews, iron jaws, and racks designed to extract confessions or ruin bodies. Prisoners were local peasants and political rivals alike, their screams echoing through corridors until settlements were paid or power shifted. The castle's architecture encourages intimidation. Look how small those windows are, and that tiny light was often the last daylight many people ever saw. You think Chillingham's reputation for ghosts is tourist bait, but its legends feed on actual brutality. Isolated nobles breeding wolves, running harebrained medical tests, and treating serfs like disposable widgets. The castle's famous Blue Boy ghost links to a child thought to have been blinded or abused. Stories not easily dismissed in a building that smelled of smoke and stale ale for centuries. In short, Chillingham is less haunted by spirits than by a long pattern of cruelty passed down like an heirloom. You think medieval aristocrats were sportsmen, but Chillingham actually bred wolves and staged savage entertainments that blurred into outright barbarity. There are accounts of live animal spectacles and medical practices that today would read as clinical neglect or cruel experiment. People were treated as scenery for privilege, and the cold stone absorbed the screams and rationalizations long after the rulers were dust. You think Elizabeth Bathory's legend is pure myth-making, but actually Chachtas Castle was the center of a gruesome chapter: aristocratic violence, alleged mass murder, and a court that coveted her wealth. Bathory's story mutated into the blood-soaked vampire myth because aristocrats loved scandal with a moral eyebrow to avert attention from their own crimes. Whether every grisly claim is literal or exaggerated, the castle itself was a place where brutality could be done in private and then repackaged as rumor. You think the sensational tales were cooked up by peasants, but there are depositions, scars, and witnesses that make a messy truth. Torture, servants' testimony, and noble shields protecting some perpetrators. The court records read like a bureaucratic horror story, witness statements, inventories, and the slow grind of political ambition using law as a weapon. The Countess became a symbol, but the system that let her act survived, quietly rearranging power like furniture. You think Montségur is a picturesque ruin, but actually, it was the site of a siege that ended with living people immolated to satisfy religious politics. The Cathars were branded heretics and marched to a mass execution that turned belief into a bonfire of bodies and belongings. Imagine the smell of singed wool and torched books, the crunch of ash underfoot. This wasn't noble sacrifice. It was systematic eradication wrapped in holy language. You think the Cathars died heroically for doctrine, but after the pyres the landscape was dotted with scorched debris and cultural erasure. Libraries and local records vanished in flames, meaning entire ways of thinking were snuffed in one theatrical act. The mountain kept those ashes, and the memory of a politics willing to burn neighbors into silence in the service of doctrinal purity. You think Kronborg is just Hamlet scenery, but the castle was a center of state power, smuggling suppression, and maritime intimidation. The crown used the fortress to control shipping and enforce taxes, turning everyday trade into a perilous routine where one wrong toll could ruin a captain's life. Executions and displays were routine reminders that the law wasn't about justice so much as maintaining revenue and obedience. You think maritime castles kept sailors safe, but Kronborg's regime often meant arbitrary fines, impressment, and the occasional hanging as a lesson for others. The cold Baltic wind carried rumors and bodies alike. Fouled ropes and damp chains tell a story of coercion, not hospitality. Think of the fortress as a tax collector with cannons. Impressive, yes, but designed to convert livelihood into submission. You think Chillin's famous prisoner was a romantic figure chained for love, but actually, Francois Bonnivard's confinement was a political statement, an aristocratic humiliation staged to silence dissent. The cells smelled of damp cloth and human filth, not poetry. The castle used imprisonment to rewrite local power. The romanticized cloister image hides a calculated use of incarceration as a tool of governance and symbolic display. You think prisoners passed time with philosophical musing, but Bonnivard's cell was about survival calculus, rationing light, scraping moldy bread, and leaving tally marks to prove you hadn't completely vanished. Political prisoners often endured slow degradation, nutritional decline, tremors, and a simmering rage that had no outlet. The cell becomes a ledger of erasure, names scratched into stone in a desperate bid for memory. You think Casillas is a fairy tale manor, but under the hill are tunnels carved by the Nazis for secret projects, forced labor, experiments, and a top-down obsession with myth and master narratives. The castle was repurposed into an industrial nightmare, with prisoners hauling rock and disappearing into concrete. Visitors today see manicured lawns, but the earth remembers the hollowed-out screams of those who built what the winners later used as mystery tour. You think those tunnels are just curious relics, but Casillas's underbelly was a factory of human exploitation, malnutrition, exhaustion, and death as part of construction quotas. Prisoners left scratches and crude graffiti to assert they existed, each mark a tiny scream against the silence. The castle above could be polished for tourists, but the tunnels keep the honest record. People disappeared into rock and often never came back. You think Bran is Dracula's main crib, but Ponari was Vlad the Impaler's real rough and ready stronghold, cramped, vertical, and built to inspire vertigo. This place smells of damp chainmail and human sweat, not theatrical bats. It's a functional fortress for someone who specialized in public cruelty. Scaling those steps was a punishment in itself, and the prison beneath would have been a polite term for a place where people were made to vanish. You think Vlad's reputation is propaganda, but Ponari stands as a theater for his cruelty. Impalement planted like flags to send a message about obedience. The landscape acted as a stage where terror reduced rebellion faster than any tax collector could. For locals, the pikes were a geography lesson in power. Don't be stubborn, or you'll become a landmark people avoid like a bad memory. You think Blarney is a cheeky souvenir stop, but the Kissing Stone sits on land threaded with pagan rituals and boundaries once policed by violence rather than photo ops. What we call kitschy tourist fun was likely an evolution of older rites where magic, fertility, and local power mixed in messy ritual. The modern gag of gift of gab glosses over a deeper history where public displays at sacred stones often had real communal consequences and ancient pacts attached. You think touching the stone is harmless, but these rituals evolved from boundary marking and oaths that had teeth. Breaking them could mean losing land or worse. The stone's power was social enforcement, an easy tool for a community to say, "We remember," so everyone behaved. Today it's sanitized into selfies, but the original uses tethered the living to obligations that could decide life, marriage, and survival. You think Dracula is a single costume, but the reality is layered. Bran is a marketing ploy, while Ponari is the actual bedrock of terror where Vlad enacted his politics. One sells t-shirts and garlic necklaces, the other sells vertigo and stories you don't tell at dinner. Both feed the myth machine, but if you're tracing real cruelty, Ponari offers practical, human-scale horror instead of gothic cosplay. You think Peel's is pure Art Nouveau romance, but behind its carved panels were rooms used for political theater, paranoia, and aristocratic whisper campaigns. Royal courts often used such places to coerce alliances with a smile and a polished dagger. The scent of polish and pipe tobacco masked strategies meant to isolate rivals into poor decisions and quiet rescindments of power. You think the greatest dramas happen on the battlefield, but often the real coups were inked in rooms like this: secret letters, coerced alliances, and the slow siphoning of influence. That folded note could cost lives. Aristocrats treated friendship like a currency with a negative balance. Peel's glamour was an investment in subtle violence. Ruin someone's reputation and they'll leave quietly, no blade required. You think famous filming locations get a glamour upgrade, but Olnwick and others often hide the human cost of fame: overworked guides, strained preservation budgets, and seasonal labor pushed to extremes. Movie magic flattens centuries of maintenance into a glossy 2-hour narrative, while staff juggle safety and spectacle. The castle becomes a production set where history is repackaged, and the people who keep it alive are the invisible supporting cast. You think tourism saves historic sites, but the truth is more ambivalent. Tourism funds upkeep but also accelerates wear, encourages sanitization, and erases uncomfortable truths to sell a palatable story. Guides trim history into sound bites, conservators patch rather than reveal scars, and the living communities around castles often get priced out. The souvenir economy handcuffs memory to nostalgia while quietly filing away complexity. You think castles were glorious homes, but many of their most persuasive statements arrived from latrine windows and chained cells, physical reminders of who controlled life and death. The smell of waste was as much an instrument of power as a sword, because who ate well and who didn't was decided inside those walls. Records and ledgers often list names as commodities. The castle's real language was scarcity, and it spoke fluently. You think legends are organic, but castles become myth machines through a mix of fear, memory, and modern marketing, the perfect recipe for selling chills. Generations supply mystery and victims supply drama. Add tourism dollars and corporations sharpen the narrative into a profitable myth. So a story that started as a prison chronicle becomes a cloak and dagger souvenir, and the truth gets folded into a much prettier box. You think snapping selfies is enough, but if you want to honor history, read plaques, support local conservation, and ask about the shadows as well as the turrets. Don't just buy the souvenir. Buy a guidebook that mentions the prisoners, the staff, and the messy bits. Question romanticized narratives and tip the guides who tell uncomfortable truths. It's how the past pays forward into a better informed present. You think this was just a spooky list, but actually we traced a pattern. Castles are built for control, not comfort. Their glamour cloaks practical cruelty, torture, containment, and social engineering. Each stone is a ledger of who was valued and who was expendable, and the myths we love are often polished versions of administrative violence. Remember, history's glare is brightest when you point it at what people tried to hide. You think we should leave history pretty, but sometimes the honest mess is the only respectful treatment, recognizing victims, acknowledging cruelty, and letting rubble speak. Castles can be marvelous and monstrous at once. Romanticization shouldn't erase accountability. If this made you curious or queasy, that's the point. History isn't comfortable, it's instructive. If this ruined your appetite, subscribe for more gruesome history and haunted realities.